Sorry, the video cut off. Anyway, so as a matter of compassion, they decide to let the person go. Okay, but notice here, so being compassionate, you may think, maybe like the compassionate, merciful thing to do in that scenario is to let the person go. All right, that sounds maybe right. And the just thing to do, the thing that that person actually deserves, they deserve to be killed, you might think, but being compassionate might entail that you let them go. So there's a conflict, right? Justice is saying, execute them for their heinous, immoral act. Compassion saying, let them go, be merciful. All right. So there's an obvious conflict here. So what do you do if you're a virtue ethicist? The problem is that you don't get any clear sense of what to do, right? If at any time the virtues conflict, it's like, well, which one do you pick? And virtue ethics doesn't give us a really clear sense of which one to pick. Okay, so that's a problem. The second objection that we're looking at is who the moral exemplars are. Okay, so when Aristotle talked about virtue ethics at his time of writing, he thought that it was kind of obvious who the moral exemplars are. So he thought like Pericles, for instance, was a moral exemplar. If you have no idea who Pericles is, you can be forgiven because nobody really talks about Pericles outside of history classes anymore, okay? And we don't look up to Pericles as being a particularly virtuous person, right? Even if you read about him, you might not think he's like a particularly great person. You might think, oh yeah, he's kind of interesting and whatever, but I don't think you think of him as like a moral exemplar. But there's lots of conflicts and disagreement on who the moral exemplars are. Who would you think that everybody would agree upon is a perfectly good person? I mean, the problem is, even if you try to pick like, you know, MLK had his problems. Gandhi definitely had his problems too. And if you don't know, I encourage you to look up what those problems are. They're pretty good people, but they had their flaws. Even Jesus, you might think, right? So there's lots of people who aren't religious who don't think Jesus is that great of a person. Okay, maybe he's a pretty good person, maybe not the greatest of people. All right, so he had those flaws too, perhaps. Or whatever other religious figures you want to look at. Okay. So anyway, the idea is that the moral exemplars in the world are hotly up to debate, it seems. And here's the problem. If we don't know who the moral exemplars are in the world, who do we know who to emulate, right? Who am I going to copy to get the virtues? And if I can't even get that, then how the heck am I going to be virtuous, right? Now, the one thing that Aristotle focuses upon, which I'm going to try to be nice to virtue ethicists here for a second here. The one thing that Aristotle focuses upon with the moral exemplars is trying to find perfectly virtuous people so they have all the good character traits, okay? Now, a way around this might be to say, well, okay, maybe there's nobody in the world who's perfectly virtuous. All right, they don't have all the good character traits. But there's people who exemplify particular character traits really well, right? So you might think of somebody who's like really courageous in your life. Maybe they're not very good in other spheres of their life. Maybe they're really courageous, but maybe not the nicest people. But you can say, okay, like I can at least emulate their behavior when it comes to being courageous, okay? Or think about like someone like Mr. Rogers, right? If you don't know who Mr. Rogers is, Mr. Rogers was he's a children's TV show creator, and he's just a really kind person, okay? If you're familiar with who Mr. Rogers is, he's insanely kind, okay? If you don't know who he is, don't worry about it, just take my word for it, okay? He's a really, really kind person, okay? He's one of the most pure-hearted people who's probably ever lived, okay? Now, I don't know how he is in other areas of his life, but he's just a really kind person, so you might think, okay, if I want to be kind, I'm going to do the kind sorts of things that Mr. Rogers does. If I want to be courageous, I'll be courageous like this one other person is, whoever you might be thinking of. You might think MLK is like a really just person, so you might think, okay, I'm going to sort of emulate him insofar as justice is concerned. So maybe what you can do instead of try to find perfectly virtuous people is just to try to find people who are really good at one particular thing, or maybe a couple, and try to exemplify them in that way. And that might help virtue ethicists out. Okay, maybe not. There's some debate on that, but that's maybe one potential response on behalf of virtue ethics. Okay. The third objection, which is maybe one that's problematic, is that virtue ethicists run into a Euthyphro dilemma-like problem. Okay, so remember the Euthyphro dilemma for divine command theory asks whether or not actions are right because God commands them or whether God commands them because they're right. And either, and you should look back in your video if you don't fully get this yet, but just the really quick version of it, if you say that actions are right because God commands them, then God's commands are arbitrary. If you say God commands them because they're right, then God really isn't needed because what makes things right or wrong isn't God's commands, it's just the fact that they're right or wrong. Okay. Virtue ethicists run into a similar problem. So virtue ethicists are going to say that actions are right just because a virtuous person would do them. All right. Now, there's a similar question you can ask, just like with the Euthyphro dilemma. Do virtuous people do actions because they're right, or are they right because a virtuous person does them? And you might see the parallels right away. If you take this first part, do virtuous people do actions because they're right? Suppose you say that's the reason why they're right. Okay, so acts are right according to virtue ethics because they're right and virtuous people act on those actions. Okay, that's equivalent to saying that God commands right actions because they're right. Here's the problem with that, though. Why are we talking about virtuous people now? Just like, why are we talking about God? We don't need the virtuous people, because if these things are right prior to the virtuous people acting on them, then the virtuous people aren't doing anything. They're just like a way of seeing what actions are right, but they don't make these actions right or wrong. They're not the thing that makes something right or wrong. They're just doing the right thing, and the reason why they do is because it's the right thing, right? So we can just cut them out, just like with God in the divine command theory scenario. Just go straight to the right actions, whatever those might be, okay? So the first case, you don't need virtuous people. And the really big problem, especially for virtue ethicists in this, is that because virtue ethicists are so focused on the kind of person you should be, right, they're going to talk about how virtuous people are, right? The kind of person you should be and the kind of person you should emulate. But if we don't need to worry about those people, like this first part is suggesting, and we just need to focus on the actions, then you lose the entire motivation for virtue ethics. Because the whole point of liking virtue ethics is that you're focused on how you should be and not just your actions. But if we're just focused on right actions, in this case, in this first scenario, then we're not focused on how we should be. And then consequently, why even be a virtue ethicist? Okay, so that's the first problem. The second problem is that, so suppose you don't like this, and you say, okay, maybe actions are right because a virtuous person does them. Well, now you run into the arbitrariness problem just like with divine command theory. So if actions are right because a virtuous person does them, all right, all that's saying is that, well, whoever the virtuous people are, whoever picked them out to be, so are you saying that if they decide to change their mind one day and decide that it's actually totally virtuous to kill innocent people, that it's all of a sudden good to kill innocent people? That doesn't seem right, okay? So the problem, just like with divine command theory, is that it doesn't actually give us a reason for thinking something is right or wrong. It's just saying, well, it's right because they did so, and why is it right to begin with? Well, it's because they did so, right? It's just this sort of bare bones reason that's a little bit circular and also arbitrary, right? So again, arbitrary just means it's done for no good reason. Okay, so there's no further reason besides the fact that they're doing it. And if they were to act otherwise, things would all of a sudden change. But it can change to all sorts of obviously immoral things. That seems like a problem. So just like with divine command theory, similarly, either we don't need to talk about virtuous people, in which case you lose the motivation to even be a virtue ethicist, or it's arbitrary, and you don't want an arbitrary moral theory. So they're kind of stuck in that Euthyphro-like dilemma. All right. So those are the objections we'll be looking at for virtue ethics.